Welcome to the Holloway Archives, where we uncover the extraordinary stories hidden within history's shadows. Today I'm bringing you a tale of unimaginable endurance, supernatural resilience, and the indomitable human spirit, the story of Samuel, a boy whose very existence defied the natural order. The Mississippi sun beat down mercilessly on the Holloway plantation in the summer of 1862, its rays cutting through the humid air like molten steel. The cotton fields stretched endlessly, white bowls dotting the landscape like scattered bones under a blood-red sky. The sound of metal striking earth echoed rhythmically as dozens of enslaved hands worked the unforgiving soil, their backs bent under the weight of another day's labor. Among them, a boy of no more than 12 moved with careful precision. Samuel, though the overseers called him nothing but boy, had learned early that survival meant invisibility. His dark skin glistened with sweat as he dragged the heavy cotton sack behind him, his small fingers working quickly to avoid the overseer's whip. "Move faster, boy!" The voice of Jeremiah Colt, the plantation's head overseer, cracked like thunder across the field. His horse snorted impatiently as he surveyed his domain, a leather whip coiled in his weathered hands. "The war ain't gonna wait for your lazy bones." Samuel's heart pounded, but he kept his eyes down. The Civil War had reached Mississippi, and tensions on the plantation had grown thick as molasses. Union forces were advancing, and whispers of freedom floated through the slave quarters like dangerous prayers. But freedom felt as distant as the stars to a boy who had known nothing but chains. The other workers, men and women whose names had been stripped away and replaced with numbers and cruel nicknames, moved around Samuel like shadows. There was old Moses, whose back bore the scars of 40 years under the lash. Sarah, whose children had been sold away one by one, and Big Tom, whose massive frame couldn't hide the broken spirit behind his eyes. "That boy's got something different about him," whispered Sarah as she worked beside Samuel. Her voice was barely audible above the rustling cotton. "Been watching him since he was knee-high. Ain't natural how he keeps going." Old Moses glanced nervously toward the overseer before responding. "Hush now, Sarah. Talk like that'll get us all in trouble. Boy's just stubborn, that's all." But Samuel had heard the whispers before. Ever since he was small, people had noticed things about him. How he could work longer than boys twice his size. How cuts and bruises seemed to heal faster on his skin. How he never seemed to break no matter how hard they tried to break him. As the day wore on, the heat became unbearable. Several workers had already collapsed, their bodies dragged to whatever shade could be found. Samuel felt the familiar burning in his chest, the way his vision would blur when his body screamed for rest. But something inside him, something he couldn't name, always pushed him forward. The plantation house loomed in the distance, its white columns stark against the darkening sky. From its windows, Samuel could sometimes see the silhouette of Master Holloway, a man whose cruelty was legendary, even among plantation owners. The master's wife had died the previous winter. Some said from shame at her husband's brutality, others from the fever that had swept through the county. Samuel. The voice belonged to Mama Ruth, the oldest woman in the quarters. She had appeared beside him as if from nowhere, her ancient eyes fixed on his face. "You listen to me, child. Storm's coming. Can feel it in my bones." Samuel looked up at the clear sky, confused. "Don't see no clouds, Mama Ruth." The old woman's weathered hand touched his shoulder briefly. "Not that kind of storm, boy. The kind that changes everything. You remember what I taught you about your grandfather?" Samuel nodded. Mama Ruth had told him stories of his grandfather, a man who had been brought from Africa in chains, but had never truly been broken. She spoke of old ways, old knowledge, old strength that ran in bloodlines like hidden rivers. "Your grandfather, he had the gift," she continued, her voice dropping to barely a whisper. "The gift of endurance, of surviving what shouldn't be survived. But gifts like that, They come with a price." Before Samuel could ask what she meant, the crack of Jeremiah Colt's whip split the air. "What's all this chattering about? You think this is a social gathering?" Mama Ruth melted back into the crowd of workers, but her words echoed in Samuel's mind as the sun began to set, painting the cotton fields in shades of orange and red. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change forever. The work bell rang across the plantation, signaling the end of another day. As the enslaved workers began their slow march back to the quarters, Samuel noticed Jeremiah Colt, watching him with particular interest. The overseer's pale eyes followed the boy's every movement, and a cruel smile played at the corners of his mouth. "Boy," Colt called out, his voice carrying across the field, "you stay behind. Got something special for you." Samuel's blood ran cold. Being singled out by the overseer never meant anything good. As the other workers reluctantly continued toward the quarters, casting worried glances back at the boy, Samuel stood alone in the vast cotton field, with the man who held the power of life and death over them all. The first stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky, and somewhere in the distance, the sound of cannon fire rumbled like approaching thunder. The war was getting closer, and with it a reckoning that would test the very limits of human endurance. The slave quarters of Holloway Plantation consisted of a row of ramshackle wooden cabins that housed nearly 200 souls. The structures were barely more than sheds, with gaps in the walls that let in rain, wind, and the ever-present Mississippi mosquitoes. As night fell, the quarters came alive, with the quiet sounds of exhausted people trying to find comfort in an uncomfortable world. Samuel sat on the dirt floor of the cabin he shared with 12 others, his back against the rough wooden wall. His stomach gnawed with hunger. The daily ration of cornmeal and salt pork was never enough. But he had learned to ignore the constant ache. Around him, the other occupants of the cabin whispered in the darkness, their voices carrying the weight of another day survived. "That boy's trouble," muttered Jake, a field hand whose left arm hung useless from an old injury. "Seen the way Colt was looking at him today, like a cat watching a mouse." "Hush your mouth," snapped Mama Ruth from her corner. "Samuel ain't done nothing wrong." "Don't matter if he done wrong or not," Jake replied. "When the overseer gets that look, somebody's going to pay." Samuel closed his eyes and tried to block out the conversation. He had been thinking about what Jeremiah Colt had said to him in the field. The overseer had circled him like a predator, asking strange questions about his family, about the stories the other slaves told about him, about whether he thought he was special. "You think you're different, don't you, boy?" Colt had said, his breath reeking of whiskey and tobacco. "Think you got some kind of magic in you? Well, we'll see about that." The memory sent a chill down Samuel's spine. He had learned early in life that being noticed was dangerous, that standing out in any way could bring swift and brutal punishment. But lately, it seemed impossible to remain invisible. A commotion outside the cabin interrupted his thoughts. Voices were raised in anger, and the sound of boots on dirt grew closer. Samuel's heart began to race as he recognized the heavy footsteps of the overseers making their way through the quarters. "Where is he?" The voice belonged to Jeremiah Colt, and it carried the particular edge that meant someone was about to suffer. "Where's that boy, Samuel?" The cabin door burst open, and Colt stood, silhouetted against the moonlight, flanked by 2 other overseers. His face was flushed with alcohol and rage, and in his hand he carried a coiled bullwhip. "There you are, you little thief!" Colt snarled, pointing directly at Samuel. "Thought you could steal from Master Holloway and get away with it?" Samuel's mouth went dry. "Sir, I ain't stolen nothin'. I've been in the fields all day. You've seen me yourself." "Don't lie to me, boy." Colt's voice rose to a roar. "Master Holloway's gold watch is missing from his study, and you were seen near the house this morning." "That ain't true," Samuel protested, scrambling to his feet. "I ain't been near the big house." But even as he spoke, Samuel knew the truth didn't matter. He had seen this before. When the masters needed someone to blame, someone to make an example of, they would find a way to justify their cruelty. The missing watch was, probably, just an excuse. Mama Ruth stepped forward, her ancient frame trembling with indignation. "Mr. Colt, sir, this boy ain't no thief. He's been working the field since before dawn. Ask any of us." Colt's eyes narrowed as he looked at the old woman. "You calling me a liar, old woman? Maybe you're in on it too. Maybe the whole lot of you are thieves." The tension in the cabin was thick enough to cut. Samuel could see the fear in the eyes of the others, the way they shrank back from Colt's rage. He knew that if he didn't do something, the overseer's wrath would fall on all of them. "Please, sir," Samuel said, stepping forward. "If something's missing, I'll help look for it, but I swear on my life I ain't taking nothing that don't belong to me." Colt studied the boy for a long moment, his pale eyes glittering with malice. "Your life, you say? Well, that's interesting, because that's exactly what you're going to stake on this." The overseer turned to his companions. "Take him to the whipping post. We'll get the truth out of him one way or another." As rough hands grabbed Samuel's arms, Mama Ruth's voice rose above the chaos. "You leave that boy alone. He ain't done nothing." But her protests fell on deaf ears. Samuel was dragged from the cabin and into the night, his bare feet scraping against the hard-packed earth. Behind him he could hear the sounds of the other slaves being forced back into their quarters, doors slamming shut like coffin lids. The whipping post stood in the center of the quarters, a thick wooden beam that had witnessed more suffering than any structure should. Countless backs had been broken against its rough surface. Countless screams had echoed from its base. As Samuel was forced to his knees before it, he could almost feel the weight of all that pain pressing down on him. "Strip him," Colt ordered, and Samuel felt his rough shirt being torn from his back. The night air was cool against his skin, raising goosebumps along his arms and shoulders. "Now then, boy," Colt said, walking slowly around the post. "I'm going to ask you one more time. Where is Master Holloway's watch?" Samuel raised his head, meeting the overseer's gaze with as much courage as he could muster. "I don't know, sir. I ain't seen no watch." Colt's smile was cold as winter. Wrong answer. The first lash of the whip cut across Samuel's back like a line of fire. The boy bit down hard on his lip to keep from crying out, tasting blood as the leather tore into his flesh. The second blow followed quickly, then the third, each one adding to the growing network of wounds across his back. "Where's the watch?" Colt demanded between lashes. "Don't know," Samuel gasped, his voice barely audible. The beating continued, each blow more vicious than the last. Samuel's vision began to blur, and he could feel warm blood running down his back and pooling in the dirt beneath him. But something strange was happening. Even as the pain threatened to overwhelm him, he felt that familiar presence inside him, that inexplicable strength that had always been there. "This boy is tougher than he looks," one of the other overseers commented. "Most would be begging for mercy by now." Colt paused, breathing heavily from his exertions. "Is that so? Well, let's see just how tough he really is." The overseer reached into his coat and pulled out a small glass vial filled with a clear liquid. Samuel had heard whispers about such things, salt water mixed with other substances, designed to make wounds burn like the fires of hell. "Hold him steady," Colt ordered, and Samuel felt hands gripping his arms and shoulders. "Let's see if this loosens his tongue." As the liquid hit his torn flesh, Samuel's world exploded into agony. The pain was beyond anything he had ever experienced, beyond anything he thought possible. His body convulsed against the restraining hands, and a scream tore from his throat that seemed to echo across the entire plantation. But even as the pain consumed him, Samuel held on to one thought. He would not break. Whatever was inside him, whatever gift or curse ran in his blood, he would not let them destroy it. He would survive this, just as his grandfather had survived, just as his people had always survived. The night was far from over, and the worst was yet to come. Dawn broke gray and merciless over Holloway Plantation, casting long shadows across the blood-stained ground where Samuel lay motionless. The whipping post stood like a silent sentinel over his broken form, its wood darkened with the evidence of the night's brutality. Jeremiah Colt stood nearby, his shirt soaked with sweat despite the cool morning air, his breathing still labored from hours of relentless punishment. "Stubborn little bastard," Colt muttered, wiping his brow with a dirty handkerchief. The whip in his other hand was slick with blood, its leather strands hanging like crimson ribbons in the pale light. Samuel's back was a canvas of destruction. Deep gashes crisscrossed his flesh from shoulders to waist, some so deep that white bone was visible beneath the torn muscle. His wrists, bound to the post with rough rope, were raw and bleeding from his struggles. Blood had pooled beneath him, soaking into the hard-packed earth until it formed a dark, sticky mud. Dr. Nathaniel Morse, the plantation's physician, knelt beside the boy's still form. His weathered hands moved carefully over Samuel's wounds, his face grave with professional concern. The doctor had seen his share of brutality in his 30 years of practicing medicine in the South, but this level of damage was extreme, even by plantation standards. "This is madness, Jeremiah," Dr. Morse said quietly, not looking up from his examination. "The boy's lost too much blood. These wounds, some of them have severed muscle completely. He needs immediate medical attention." Colt spat into the dirt, his pale eyes cold and unforgiving. "Boy's a thief and a liar. He gets what he deserves." "He's dying," the doctor said bluntly. "Without proper treatment, he'll be dead within hours, maybe less." "Good," Colt replied. "Save us the trouble of feeding him." Dr. Morse finally looked up, his expression a mixture of disgust and professional frustration. "You've gone too far this time, Master. Holloway won't be pleased when he learns you've destroyed valuable property over a missing watch." "Master Holloway gave me permission to handle this as I saw fit," Colt lied smoothly. "Besides, the boy confessed right before he passed out." The doctor's eyes narrowed. He had known Jeremiah Colt for years, and he recognized the signs of a man covering his tracks. But arguing further would be pointless and potentially dangerous. In the current climate, with Union forces advancing and tensions running high, even a respected physician had to be careful about challenging the plantation's authority structure. "At least let me clean the wounds," Dr. Morse said. "Basic human decency demands it." "No," Colt's voice was final. "Boy stays exactly as he is. Let him think about what happens to thieves while he bleeds out." As if summoned by their conversation, Master Holloway himself appeared, striding across the yard with the confident gait of a man accustomed to absolute power. Richard Holloway was a tall, imposing figure in his 50s, his silver hair perfectly groomed despite the early hour. His pale blue eyes took in the scene with the detached interest of someone examining livestock. "What's the situation here, Colt?" Holloway asked, his voice carrying the cultured accent of old Southern aristocracy. "Caught the thief, sir," Colt replied, straightening his posture. "Boy confessed to stealing your watch. Gave him the punishment he deserved." Holloway walked slowly around the whipping post, studying Samuel's motionless form with clinical interest. "Confessed, did he? And where is my watch now?" Colt's confidence faltered slightly. "Still working on that, sir. Boy passed out before he could tell us where he hid it." "I see." Holloway's tone was neutral, but Dr. Morse caught the subtle edge of skepticism. "And you're certain this boy is the culprit?" "Absolutely, sir. Saw him near the house myself." Holloway nodded slowly, then turned to the doctor. "What's your assessment, Nathaniel?" Dr. Morse chose his words carefully. "The boy has sustained severe injuries. Without medical intervention, he will almost certainly die within the next few hours." "How unfortunate," Holloway said, though his tone suggested he found it anything but. "Still, justice must be served. Leave him as he is." As the three men continued their discussion, none of them noticed the slight movement of Samuel's fingers. Deep within his unconscious mind, something was stirring. the same inexplicable force that had always set him apart from others. His breathing, though shallow, remained steady. His heart, though weakened by blood loss, continued to beat with stubborn persistence. From the slave quarters, hidden faces watched through cracks in doors and windows. Mama Ruth stood in the doorway of her cabin, her ancient eyes fixed on the boy's still form. Tears streamed down her weathered cheeks as she whispered words in a language older than the plantation, older than the cotton fields, older than the chains that bound her people. "Hold on, child," she murmured. "Your grandfather's blood runs strong in you. Hold on." The morning sun climbed higher, its rays beating down on Samuel's exposed back. The flies had already begun to gather, drawn by the scent of blood and torn flesh. Dr. Morse had been dismissed, sent back to the big house with strict orders not to interfere. Colt had stationed 2 guards nearby with instructions to ensure no one approached the whipping post. Hours passed. The sun reached its zenith, turning the air thick and oppressive. Samuel's body should have been growing cold. His wounds should have stopped bleeding as his heart gave out. But something impossible was happening. Something that defied every law of medicine and nature that Dr. Morse understood. The boy was still breathing. Not only breathing, but his pulse remained detectable. Weak, but steady. The bleeding had slowed to a trickle, not because he was dying, but because his body seemed to be somehow conserving what blood remained. It was as if some internal mechanism was working to keep him alive against all odds. By afternoon, word had begun to spread through the plantation. Whispered conversations in the fields, furtive glances toward the whipping post, growing amazement at what they were witnessing. The boy who should have been dead hours ago was still clinging to life, with a tenacity that seemed almost supernatural. Dr. Morse returned twice, unable to stay away despite his orders. Each time he found Samuel's condition unchanged, critical but stable, hovering on the edge of death, but refusing to cross over. It challenged everything the doctor thought he knew about human physiology. "It's not possible," he muttered to himself during his second visit. "No one survives this level of trauma without treatment. No one." But Samuel was surviving. As the sun began to set on his first day bound to the whipping post, he remained alive, his body somehow finding the strength to endure what should have been impossible. The slaves in the quarters began to whisper of miracles, of divine intervention, of ancient powers that ran deeper than the cruelty of their oppressors. Jeremiah Colt, meanwhile, grew increasingly agitated as the day wore on. He had expected the boy to be dead by noon, his body a grim reminder to the other slaves of what happened to those who crossed the Boa Plantations Authority. Instead, Samuel's continued survival was becoming a source of unrest, a symbol of defiance that threatened to undermine the very foundation of fear upon which the plantation's control rested. As darkness fell once again, Colt made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his days. If the boy wouldn't die naturally, then perhaps he needed additional encouragement. The second night of Samuel's ordeal was about to begin, and with it a test of endurance that would challenge the very limits of human survival. 3 days had passed since Samuel was bound to the whipping post, and the impossible had become undeniable. The boy who should have died within hours of his brutal punishment was not only alive but showing signs of something that defied all medical understanding. Dr. Nathaniel Morse knelt beside Samuel's still form in the pre-dawn darkness, his hands trembling as he checked the boy's pulse for the dozenth time that day. "Steady," he whispered to himself, his voice filled with a mixture of awe and terror. Still steady. The wounds on Samuel's back, while still horrific to behold, had stopped bleeding entirely. More disturbing still, the edges of some of the deeper gashes appeared to be slowly knitting together, forming the beginnings of scar tissue at a rate that should have taken weeks, not days. Dr. Morse had practiced medicine for 3 decades, had seen men survive seemingly impossible injuries in the war, but nothing had prepared him for this. "You're not supposed to be alive," the doctor murmured, studying the boy's peaceful face. Despite the trauma his body had endured, Samuel's breathing remained deep and regular, as if he were simply sleeping rather than clinging to life by an invisible thread. From the slave quarters, the sound of hushed voices carried on the morning breeze. Word of Samuel's survival had spread beyond the plantation, carried by field hands who worked neighboring properties and house slaves who overheard their masters' conversations. The story was growing, with each telling the boy who couldn't die, the child who defied the overseer's whip, the living miracle bound to the whipping post. Mama Ruth emerged from the quarters, as she had every morning since Samuel's punishment began, carrying a small wooden bowl filled with water. The guards had been ordered not to let anyone approach the boy, but the old woman's persistence had worn down their resolve. They now allowed her to wet Samuel's lips with a few drops of water, though they watched her carefully for any sign of additional aid. "Morning, child," she whispered as she knelt beside him, her ancient fingers gentle as they touched the water. To his cracked lips, "Still fighting, I see. Your grandfather would be proud." Samuel's eyes fluttered open at the sound of her voice, focusing on her weathered face with surprising clarity. "Mama Ruth," he whispered, his voice barely audible, but unmistakably strong. The old woman's eyes widened in amazement. It was the first time he had spoken since the beating began, the first sign that his mind remained intact despite the trauma his body had endured. "Hush now," she said, glancing nervously at the guards. "Save your strength." "The watch," Samuel whispered, his words so quiet that only Mama Ruth could hear them. "Hidden in Colt's own quarters. Saw him take it." Mama Ruth's blood ran cold. If Samuel was telling the truth, then Jeremiah Colt had orchestrated the entire incident, stealing the watch himself and framing the boy to cover his tracks. It was a level of calculated cruelty that shocked even her, despite decades of witnessing the worst of human nature. "You sure about this, child?" she whispered back. Samuel's slight nod was barely perceptible, but it was enough. Mama Ruth rose slowly, her mind racing with the implications of what she had just learned. If she could somehow prove Samuel's innocence, it might save his life, but it would also mean exposing Jeremiah Colt's deception, a dangerous gamble that could result in her own death. As the morning progressed, more people began to gather at a respectful distance from the whipping post. Field hands found excuses to work nearby. House slaves lingered longer than necessary when their duties brought them to the yard. Even some of the white overseers began to cast curious glances in Samuel's direction. The boy's continued survival was becoming a spectacle, a source of fascination and unease that rippled through the plantation's rigid social structure. Dr. Morse returned again at midday, this time accompanied by a colleague from a neighboring plantation. Dr. James Hartwell was a younger man, recently graduated from medical school in Charleston, and his scientific curiosity had been piqued by Morse's descriptions of Samuel's condition. "Extraordinary," Dr. Hartwell murmured as he examined the boy's wounds. "The rate of healing is unlike anything I've encountered in my studies. How do you explain it?" Dr. Morse shook his head grimly. "I can't. By every measure of medical science, this boy should have died on the first day. The blood loss alone should have been fatal, not to mention the trauma to his muscular and nervous systems. And yet, here he is," Dr. Hartwell observed, checking Samuel's pulse and finding it surprisingly strong. "His vital signs are actually improving. It's as if his body is somehow adapting to the trauma, finding ways to survive that shouldn't be possible." The two doctors continued their examination in hushed tones, documenting their observations with the methodical precision of men of science, confronted with the impossible. Neither was willing to voice the thought that lurked in both their minds, that they were witnessing something that transcended the boundaries of natural law. Meanwhile, Jeremiah Colt watched from the porch of the overseer's house, his face dark with frustration and growing concern. The boy's survival was becoming a problem, a symbol of defiance that threatened to undermine his authority. Worse still, he could see the way the other slaves looked at Samuel with a mixture of awe and hope that made Colt's blood run cold. "Stubborn little bastard," he muttered, taking a long pull from a bottle of whiskey. The alcohol had become his constant companion over the past 3 days, a way to numb the growing unease that gnawed at his conscience. He had expected Samuel to die quickly and quietly, providing a grim example to the other slaves. Instead, the boy's survival was turning him into something approaching a folk hero. As afternoon faded into evening, Colt made a decision that would seal his own fate. If Samuel wouldn't die from his wounds, then perhaps it was time to take more direct action. The boy had become too dangerous to live, too powerful a symbol of resistance to be allowed to survive. But as Colt reached for his pistol, a commotion erupted from the direction of the big house. Master Holloway was striding across the yard, his face flushed with anger, and behind him walked a figure that made Colt's blood freeze in his veins. Sheriff Thomas Brennan, the county's chief law enforcement officer. "Colt," Holloway's voice cracked like a whip across the yard. "Get over here now." As the overseer approached on unsteady legs, Sheriff Brennan held up a familiar object that glinted in the fading sunlight. Master Holloway's gold pocket watch, found exactly where Samuel had said it would be, hidden in Jeremiah Colt's own quarters. The boy's impossible survival was about to be vindicated, but the revelation would bring its own dangers. In a world where the truth was often more dangerous than lies, Samuel's vindication might prove to be just another form of death sentence. The fourth night was falling, and with it the beginning of a reckoning that would test not just Samuel's miraculous endurance, but the very foundations of the world that had tried so hard to destroy him. The revelation of Jeremiah Colt's deception sent shockwaves through Holloway Plantation like a stone thrown into still water. Sheriff Thomas Brennan stood in the fading daylight, holding Master Holloway's gold pocket watch as evidence of the overseer's betrayal, while Colt himself swayed drunkenly nearby, his face a mask of desperate defiance. "Found it exactly where the old woman said it would be," Sheriff Brennan announced, his voice carrying across the yard to the growing crowd of onlookers. Hidden under a loose floorboard in Colt's quarters, wrapped in a piece of cloth. Master Holloway's face was a study in controlled fury. Richard Holloway prided himself on maintaining absolute order on his plantation, and the discovery that his head overseer had orchestrated such an elaborate deception was both personally humiliating and professionally damaging. In a time of war, when every aspect of plantation life was under scrutiny, such scandals could have far-reaching consequences. "You lying bastard," Holloway said quietly, his cultured voice carrying more menace than any shout. "You tortured an innocent boy to cover your own theft." Colt's bloodshot eyes darted between the sheriff and his employer, his whiskey-addled mind struggling to formulate a defense. "That boy, he's not natural, sir. You've seen it yourself. No normal child survives what he's been through. He's some kind of devil." "The only devil here is you," Dr. Morse interjected, stepping forward from where he had been examining Samuel. "That boy has endured 4 days of torture that would have killed a grown man, and you want to blame him for your own crimes?" Sheriff Brennan nodded grimly. "Jeremiah Colt, you're under arrest for theft and for the unlawful punishment of plantation property. You'll be held in the county jail pending trial." As the sheriff moved to place Colt in shackles, the overseer's composure finally cracked completely. "You don't understand," he screamed, pointing a shaking finger toward Samuel's still form at the whipping post. "That boy ain't human. Look at him. 4 days without food or water, wounds that should have killed him, and he's still breathing. It ain't natural." The crowd that had gathered slaves, overseers, and even some neighboring plantation owners who had come to witness the spectacle fell silent at Colt's words. Because as much as they might despise the man, they couldn't deny the truth of what he was saying. Samuel's survival was indeed impossible by any measure of human endurance. Dr. Hartwell, the young physician from Charleston, stepped forward with the careful precision of a man of science. "Sheriff, if I may, I've been documenting this boy's condition for the past 2 days, and I must say that Mr. Colt, despite his obvious guilt in the matter of the theft, is not entirely wrong about the unusual nature of the boy's survival. All eyes turned to the doctor as he continued. By every measure of medical science, this child should have died within hours of his punishment. The blood loss, the trauma, the exposure, any one of these factors should have been fatal. Yet not only has he survived, but his wounds are healing at a rate that defies explanation. Master Holloway's eyes narrowed as he studied Samuel's motionless form. What exactly are you suggesting, Doctor? I'm not suggesting anything supernatural, Dr. Hartwell said carefully, but there are documented cases in medical literature of individuals who possess unusual physiological traits, enhanced healing, resistance to trauma, extraordinary endurance. Perhaps this boy is simply one of those rare cases. From the crowd of slaves, Mama Ruth stepped forward, her ancient frame trembling with a mixture of fear and determination. If I may speak, Master Holloway, sir. Holloway looked surprised at the old woman's boldness, but nodded for her to continue. That boy's grandfather, he was brought from Africa when I was just a child, Mama Ruth said, her voice carrying clearly across the yard. The old folks, they said he had the gift, the ability to endure what others couldn't. They said it ran in bloodlines, passed down from father to son. Superstitious nonsense, Dr. Morse muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. Maybe so, Mama Ruth replied. But that boy's been different since the day he was born. Stronger, tougher, able to work longer than children twice his size. And now, you've all seen what he can survive. Sheriff Brennan looked uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking. Regardless of the boy's unusual constitution, the fact remains that he was falsely accused and brutally punished. Justice demands that he be released and given proper medical care. Absolutely not, Master Holloway said firmly. The boy is my property, and I'll decide what happens to him. Sir, Dr. Morse interjected, the boy needs immediate medical attention. His survival thus far is remarkable, but he's still critically injured. Holloway studied Samuel for a long moment, his calculating mind weighing the various factors at play. The boy's survival had already become the subject of widespread discussion, and word was spreading to neighboring plantations and beyond. In the current climate, with Union forces advancing and the institution of slavery under increasing pressure, such attention was unwelcome. Very well, Holloway said finally. Cut him down and take him to the medical quarters, but he's to be kept under guard at all times. I want to know exactly what we're dealing with here. As Sheriff Brennan led the shackled Jeremiah Colt away, Dr. Morse and Dr. Hartwell carefully freed Samuel from the whipping post. The boy's eyes fluttered open as they lifted him, and for a moment his gaze met that of Master Holloway. In that brief exchange, something passed between them. A recognition of power, of will, of forces that transcended the simple relationship between master and slave. Interesting, Holloway murmured to himself as the doctors carried Samuel toward the medical quarters. Very interesting indeed. As night fell over the plantation, the events of the day continued to reverberate through the community. In the slave quarters, hushed conversations spoke of miracles and divine intervention. In the big house, Master Holloway sat in his study, contemplating the implications of harboring a slave whose very existence challenged the natural order. And in the medical quarters, Samuel lay on a clean bed for the first time in his life, his wounds finally receiving proper care. But even as his body began to heal, darker forces were already moving against him. Word of the miracle slave was spreading beyond the plantation, reaching ears that viewed such phenomena as either valuable commodities or dangerous threats. The boy who had survived the impossible was about to discover that survival itself could be the most dangerous gift of all. 2 weeks had passed since Samuel's release from the whipping post, and the medical quarters of Holloway Plantation had become an unlikely center of attention. Dr. Morse and Dr. Hartwell had established a makeshift laboratory in the adjacent room, documenting every aspect of Samuel's recovery with the methodical precision of men confronting the impossible. "Look at this," Dr. Hartwell whispered, examining Samuel's back through a magnifying glass. "The deepest wounds have not only healed, but left minimal scarring. In some cases, the skin appears stronger than before the injury occurred." Dr. Morse nodded grimly, making notes in his leather-bound journal. "I've been practicing medicine for 30 years, James, and I've never seen anything like it. The boy's cellular regeneration rate is beyond anything in medical literature." Samuel lay quietly on the examination table, his dark eyes following the doctor's movements with intelligent curiosity. Despite the trauma he had endured, his mind remained sharp and alert. He had learned to listen carefully to the conversations around him, understanding that his unusual condition had made him the subject of intense scrutiny. "The muscle tissue has not only repaired itself but appears to have increased in density," Dr. Hartwell continued. "It's as if his body is adapting, becoming stronger in response to the trauma." Through the window, Samuel could see the cotton fields where he had once worked, now tended by other hands while he remained confined to the medical quarters. Master Holloway had ordered that he be kept under constant guard, ostensibly for his own protection, but clearly also to prevent his escape. The boy had become too valuable and too dangerous to be allowed his freedom. A commotion outside interrupted the doctor's examination. Voices were raised in heated discussion, and the sound of multiple horses approaching suggested the arrival of important visitors. Dr. Morse moved to the window, his expression growing troubled as he observed the scene unfolding in the plantation yard. "We have company," he announced, "and I don't think they're here for a social call." 3 carriages had arrived at Holloway Plantation, their occupants emerging with the purposeful movements of men on serious business. Samuel recognized Sheriff Brennan among them, but the others were strangers. Well-dressed men whose bearing suggested wealth and authority. Leading the group was a tall, distinguished gentleman in his 60s, his silver hair perfectly groomed and his expensive clothing marking him as a man of considerable means. Behind him walked 2 younger men, one carrying a leather satchel that suggested medical training, the other bearing the unmistakable bearing of a military officer despite his civilian clothes. "Dr. Aldrich Peyton," Dr. Morse said quietly, recognizing the lead figure. "One of the most prominent physicians in the South. What could he possibly want here?" The answer came soon enough as Master Holloway led the group toward the medical quarters. Samuel could hear their voices growing closer, their conversation carrying the weight of serious business. "Unprecedented case," Dr. Peyton was saying as they approached. "If the reports are accurate, this could revolutionize our understanding of human physiology." "The reports are accurate," Master Holloway replied. "I've seen it with my own eyes. The boy survived injuries that should have been fatal, and his recovery has been nothing short of miraculous." The door to the medical quarters opened, and the distinguished visitors filed in, their eyes immediately focusing on Samuel, with the intensity of scientists examining a rare specimen. Dr. Peyton approached the examination table with measured steps, his pale blue eyes studying every detail of the boy's appearance. "Remarkable," he murmured, his voice carrying the authority of decades of medical experience. "May I examine him, Dr. Morse?" Morse nodded reluctantly, stepping aside to allow the renowned physician access to his patient. Dr. Peyton's examination was thorough and professional, his experienced hands checking Samuel's pulse, examining his healing wounds, and testing his reflexes with practiced efficiency. "Extraordinary," Dr. Peyton announced after several minutes. "The muscle density, the rate of cellular regeneration, the cardiovascular efficiency, all far beyond normal human parameters." The military officer stepped forward, his interest clearly piqued. "Doctor, in your professional opinion, could these abilities be replicated, enhanced, controlled?" Samuel felt a chill run down his spine at the man's words. The implications were clear. They weren't just interested in studying his condition, they wanted to exploit it. "That's a fascinating question, Colonel Morrison," Dr. Peyton replied. "With proper study and experimentation, it might be possible to understand the mechanisms behind these abilities, perhaps even to enhance them further." Master Holloway's eyes gleamed with avarice. "Gentlemen, I think we should discuss the terms of any such arrangement. The boy is, after all, my property." "Indeed." Dr. Peyton agreed. "We're prepared to make you a very generous offer for the purchase of this specimen. A research facility in Richmond has the resources to conduct a proper scientific study." Samuel's blood ran cold as he realized what was being discussed. He was being sold, not as a slave to work in fields or houses, but as a laboratory subject to be studied, tested, and experimented upon. The thought of being trapped in some medical facility, subjected to endless examinations and procedures, filled him with a terror deeper than anything he had experienced at the whipping post. Dr. Morse stepped forward, his face flushed with indignation. "Gentlemen, this is a human being we're discussing, not some laboratory animal. The boy has already endured more trauma than any person should have to bear." "The boy is property," Colonel Morrison replied coldly. "And in times of war, all resources must be utilized for the greater good. If his abilities can be understood and replicated, it could provide significant advantages to our forces. The Confederacy is fighting for its very survival," Dr. Peyton added. "If this boy's condition can help us develop soldiers who are more resilient, more capable of surviving battlefield injuries, then it's our duty to pursue that knowledge." As the adults continued their discussion, treating him as if he were an object rather than a person, Samuel felt something stirring within him. The same inexplicable force that had sustained him through 4 days of torture, but this time it wasn't just about survival. This time it was about resistance. The boy who had endured the impossible was about to discover that his greatest test wasn't behind him, it was just beginning. And as the storm clouds of war gathered overhead, Samuel would have to find the strength not just to survive, but to fight for his freedom in a world that saw him as nothing more than a valuable commodity. The negotiations continued late into the night, but Samuel had already made his decision. Whatever the cost, whatever the risk, he would not allow himself to become a laboratory specimen. The blood of his grandfather, the strength of his ancestors, the will that had sustained him through the darkest hours, all of it would be focused on a single goal: escape. The moon hung low and blood red over Holloway Plantation as Samuel made his final preparations for escape. 3 days had passed since Dr. Peyton's visit, and the negotiations for his sale had reached their conclusion. By morning, he would be loaded into a wagon and transported to Richmond, where he would disappear forever into the depths of a Confederate medical facility. But Samuel had no intention of allowing that fate to befall him. The medical quarters were quiet except for the soft snoring of the guard who had been assigned to watch him. Samuel had spent the past week carefully observing the man's habits, noting how he dozed off in the early hours before dawn, lulled by the apparent docility of his charge. Tonight, that carelessness would prove fatal. Moving with the silent grace of someone who had learned to be invisible, Samuel slipped from his bed and approached the sleeping guard. The man's keys hung from his belt, and Samuel's enhanced reflexes allowed him to lift them without causing even the slightest disturbance. Within moments, he had unlocked the shackles that bound his ankles and was moving toward the door. The plantation grounds were bathed in silver moonlight, creating a landscape of deep shadows and pale illumination. Samuel knew every inch of this place, every building, every path, every hiding spot. But he also knew that his escape would be discovered within hours, and when it was, the pursuit would be relentless. His first stop was the slave quarters, where Mama Ruth waited in the darkness of her cabin. The old woman had been expecting him, her ancient eyes bright with a mixture of pride and sorrow. "Time to go, child," she whispered, pressing a small bundle into his hands. "Food for the journey, and something else your grandfather would have wanted you to have." Samuel unwrapped the bundle to find dried meat, hardtack, and a small leather pouch containing what appeared to be seeds or dried herbs. But it was the final item that took his breath away: a small, carved wooden figure, no larger than his thumb, depicting a man with arms raised toward the sky. "Your grandfather carved that during the crossing from Africa," Mama Ruth explained. "Said it would protect his bloodline, keep the old strength alive in his descendants. Reckon you're going to need all the protection you can get." Samuel clutched the carving tightly, feeling a warmth spread through his fingers that seemed to pulse in rhythm with his heartbeat. "Thank you, Mama Ruth, for everything." "Don't thank me yet, child. You got a long road ahead, and they ain't going to give up easy. But you remember what I told you. Your grandfather's blood runs strong in you. Trust in that strength, and it'll see you through." Samuel embraced the old woman briefly, then slipped back into the night. His next destination was the overseer's quarters, where Jeremiah Colt's replacement kept the plantation's weapons. If he was going to survive in the wilderness, he would need more than just his unusual constitution. The new overseer, a man named Pike, was known for his heavy drinking, and Samuel found him passed out at his desk with an empty bottle beside him. The weapons cabinet was locked, but Samuel's enhanced strength made short work of the flimsy mechanism. He selected a hunting knife, a small pistol, and ammunition, along with a coil of rope that might prove useful. As he prepared to leave the quarters, Samuel paused at Pike's desk, where a map of the surrounding area lay spread out. His eyes traced the various routes leading north toward the Union lines that represented his only hope of true freedom. The journey would be treacherous through swampland and hostile territory, but it was his only chance. A sound from outside froze Samuel in place. The soft whinny of a horse, followed by the creak of leather and the jingle of spurs. Someone was approaching the overseer's quarters, and Samuel realized with growing horror that his escape had been discovered sooner than expected. "Pike!" The voice belonged to Master Holloway himself, and it carried the sharp edge of anger and urgency. "Wake up, you drunken fool! The boy is gone!" Samuel's mind raced as he looked for an escape route. The quarters had only one door, and Holloway was approaching it rapidly. The windows were too small for him to fit through, and there was nowhere to hide in the sparsely furnished room. But as panic threatened to overwhelm him, Samuel felt that familiar presence stirring within him. The inexplicable strength that had sustained him through the whipping post, the resilience that had amazed his doctors, the power that ran in his bloodline like a hidden river. This time, however, it manifested in a way he had never experienced before. Time seemed to slow around him, his senses becoming preternaturally acute. He could hear Holloway's footsteps on the wooden porch, could smell the man's cologne and the lingering scent of his evening cigar. Most remarkably, he could sense the exact moment when Holloway would reach for the door handle. Moving with fluid precision, Samuel positioned himself behind the door just as it swung open. Holloway stepped into the room, his attention focused on the unconscious Pike, and Samuel slipped out behind him like a shadow. By the time the plantation owner realized what had happened, the boy was already disappearing into the darkness. "There!" Holloway's shout echoed across the plantation grounds. "He's heading for the woods! Sound the alarm!" The plantation erupted into chaos as bells began ringing and torches flared to life. Samuel could hear the baying of bloodhounds being released from their kennels, their keen noses already picking up his scent. He had perhaps a 10-minute head start before the pursuit began in earnest. Samuel ran through the cotton fields with supernatural speed, his enhanced physiology allowing him to maintain a pace that would have exhausted a grown man. Behind him, the sounds of pursuit grew louder. Shouting voices, barking dogs, the thunder of hoofbeats as mounted overseers joined the hunt. The edge of the plantation bordered a vast swampland that stretched for miles toward the north. It was treacherous territory filled with quicksand, venomous snakes, and alligators, but it also offered the best chance of losing his pursuers. Samuel plunged into the murky water without hesitation, feeling the cool liquid close around his legs as he waded deeper into the marsh. The bloodhounds reached the water's edge and began circling in confusion, their scent trail lost in the stagnant pools. Samuel could hear the frustrated curses of the overseers as they realized their quarry had escaped into terrain where horses were useless and men could easily become lost forever. "He's in the swamp," someone shouted. "We'll never find him in there." "Then we wait," came Master Holloway's cold reply. "Post guards at every exit point." The boy has to come out eventually, and when he does, we'll be waiting. But Samuel had no intention of coming out the way he had gone in. Using his enhanced strength and endurance, he began the grueling journey through the heart of the swampland, navigating by the stars and trusting in the ancient wisdom that seemed to flow through his veins like liquid fire. Hours passed as he made his way through the treacherous terrain, his body adapting to the challenges with the same miraculous resilience that had sustained him through the whipping post. When venomous snakes struck at him, their fangs seemed to barely penetrate his skin. When he stumbled into quicksand, his enhanced reflexes allowed him to escape before being trapped. When exhaustion threatened to overwhelm him, that inexplicable inner strength pushed him forward. As dawn broke over the Mississippi wilderness, Samuel emerged from the northern edge of the swampland, miles from Holloway Plantation and closer to the Union lines than he had ever been. His clothes were torn and muddy, his body bore new cuts and bruises, but his spirit remained unbroken. In the distance, he could hear the faint sound of cannon fire, the ongoing civil war that had torn the nation apart. But for Samuel, that sound represented hope. Somewhere beyond the horizon lay freedom, and he would reach it or die trying. The boy who had survived the impossible was now free, carrying within him not just the strength of his ancestors, but the promise of a future where his extraordinary gifts could be used for something greater than mere survival. The road ahead would be long and dangerous, but Samuel had already proven that he could endure anything the world threw at him. As he disappeared into the morning mist, heading north toward an uncertain but hopeful future, the legend of the slave boy who couldn't be broken began to spread throughout the South. Some would call it a miracle. Others would dismiss it as superstition. But all would remember the story of Samuel, the boy whose impossible survival had challenged the very foundations of a world built on cruelty and oppression. His journey was far from over, but for the first time in his young life, Samuel was truly free. And that freedom, won through suffering and sustained by an inexplicable strength, would prove to be the most powerful force of all. This has been another incredible story from the Holloway Archives. If you enjoyed this tale of extraordinary survival and supernatural endurance, please subscribe and let us know in the comments what other hidden stories from history you'd like us to explore. Until next time, remember that sometimes the most unbelievable stories are the ones that need to be told the most.